Welcome to Compass, finding spirituality in the everyday. In today's episode, we're talking with Christine Valters Paintner about the spiritual significance of fasting and Lent. Christine is the founder of the Online Abbey of the Arts, and in this episode, she shares her insights on how fasting can go beyond our traditional ideas about abstaining from food and the like, and can instead be a way to open ourselves to a deeper encounter with the divine. Christine outlines the various forms of fasting, including from multitasking, inattention, scarcity, speed, and certainty. What we find is that there is a connection between fasting, contemplative practice, and creativity. And Christine shares her personal experiences and 7 practices from her book that can help listeners engage in meditative practices alongside fasting. It's very cool stuff ahead on Compass. If you find this episode valuable, then spread some gratitude by leaving a rating or review on a platform like Apple Podcasts or the Spotify mobile app. Thanks very much. Let me tell you a bit more about Christine. She founded the Abbey of the Arts, which is a virtual monastery offering classes and resources on contemplative practice and creative expression. We'll get into a deeper description of that in our conversation. Christine is also a Benedictine Oblate, which means that she lives as a monk in the world. Christine is also a poet, writer, spiritual director, retreat facilitator, teacher, and pilgrimage guide. She's authored over 20 books, including her most recent, which is called A Different Kind of Fast. And that helps us enter our hearts. It kind of strips away old patterns and habits, and we'll get quite into depth on all of that as well. Also want to note that Christine lives in Galway, Ireland. Really interesting conversation in store, so let's get to it on the Compass Podcast. But Christine, you may win the award for farthest traveled, in a sense, to be a part of the Compass Podcast. Thank you so much for bridging across time zones and making this work. How goes it with your soul today?
It's going very well. Yeah, I love Lent, and I love being in this season, and I find that whole invitation to dig into something even meatier just really, it brings me alive. So
that's refreshing to hear, because Lent carries sort of the heavy connotations along with it. And yet, again and again, I hear people expressing, I love Lent. This is a great season. What's the appeal for you?
Well, I think, as human beings, we're always distracted from our sort of deeper desires and intentions in life. And I think these liturgical seasons, Advent also being one that I love, are such beautiful opportunities for us to return, that image of returning again with our whole heart, or beginning again. I really believe that our practice is not about being perfect all the time, every day, because then we just set ourselves up for failure. And that when we fall away from practice, we're always invited back. And there's almost like a refreshment or a renewal that comes, when we've been away from something for a little while, and then we deepen into it again, and we're like, oh, I love this. Like, why did I stop doing this for a while? And it's because I'm human, and because life has a way of intervening. And so it's a beautiful way just to call us back to that journey again.
Yeah. Well, we're going to get into some of the aspects of addressing our deepest longings through the lens of fasting. But first, I'm just super curious and want to learn more about your context of faith community and ministry. So we've had a series of episodes on the Compass Podcast about the fresh and innovative ways that the church kind of moves out into the world. And Online Abbey is definitely something that fits that bill. So can you tell us what the Online Abbey of the Arts looks like?
Yeah, well, we've been around for almost 18 years now. So, I started kind of back when internet stuff was, relatively new, and I'm grateful for it, because our Abbey basically invites people who are at that intersection of contemplative practice and creative expression. So people who would identify with what I call like the archetype of the monk and the archetype of the artist. And that intersection, is often a place where, they sort of have a lot of people who feel like the oddballs or the misfits in their communities because they really are drawn to some of that quiet prayer, but they're also really drawn to that creative expression. So anyway, our community was set up to sort of meet those needs, and then being virtual, we get to find the monks and artists who are hidden in like South Africa and Australia and the US and Canada, and of course here in Ireland and the UK and other places. And essentially our website has a number of programs. We have a whole set of prayer cycles that we've created, 5 weeks of morning and evening prayer on different themes. So there's morning and evening prayer, and those are freely available for people. And every day we send out a newsletter if people want it, where they can say like, pray with us today. Like, this is our morning prayer. This is our evening prayer. So it's a way for us to keep connected. And then of course we do have, live online programs where people can meet in real time as well. So yeah, kind of a combination of each, and of course the books that I write as well. So
yeah, where do you find a lot of your people are interacting with each other, or having conversations with one another?
Well, a lot of it's in our retreat forums, because all of our multi-week programs there that we have facilitated forums where people have conversations. Some of it happens, we have a Facebook group called the Holy Disorder of Dancing Monks, and some of the conversation happens there as well. So we have a couple different sort of platforms for that.
All right. Well, thanks for that perspective. In this episode, really we want to focus on the spiritual practice of fasting. And a lot of us, when we hear that, we're triggered to think that, oh, well, that means I'm giving up food, right? I'm going without for a certain time. You've written a book that really gives us a broader sense of what fasting can be. Can you tell us about some of the alternative forms or broader forms of fasting?
Yeah, well, I'll start by saying, traditionally we do think of, giving up meat or giving up chocolate. And I like to say that, Lent is not a second chance at New Year's resolutions, and it's not a chance to have like a diet that's spiritually, grounded. Not that there's anything wrong with those things, but really the core of what the fasting is about clearing space for that more intimate encounter with the divine in a variety of ways. And so, multiple religious traditions have traditions of fasting, and they go hand in hand with feasting, right? So the feasting really only has meaning in partnership with the fastings, right? We have to kind of have those times of sort of, clearing things out so that then we can really make space for the abundance of the holy, however that manifests in our lives.
So how might fasting in this age present an alternative to some of the ways in which we're distracted?
Yeah, well, one of the ways that I talk about, I talk about 6 different ways in the book. And one of them is, for instance, fasting from multitasking and inattention. And of course, our attention is drawn, in 100 different directions every day by, all of the things, doom scrolling online, and as well as all the open windows on our computers, and the little notifications, and drives me crazy that, I could get messages in WhatsApp and Facebook Messenger and Instagram and my email and my text messages. And it can be a little bit overwhelming. And those are things we do have to navigate to be able to live in the world that we live in. And we can also allow this time to be an opportunity to kind of streamline some of that and pay attention, like where is my focus and attention going? And is it going to the place that I really want it to? How do I bring that heart of presence to what I love, to the divine, to my relationships? Like, what a rare gift it is to really listen to another person without anticipating what I'm going to be saying or without trying to get other things done at the same time. So that idea of all of the fasts are paired with something to embrace. And so the fasting from the multitasking is embracing this full presence to the moment. And we won't be able to do that all day, every day, but we can cultivate that practice and that awareness so that we become more in the habit of being able to focus on things. And even, in work and computer stuff, I find, if I turn off a number of things and I just focus on writing for an hour or 2 hours, like I get everything done still, but I feel less anxious. I feel less, unraveled at the end of it because my attention hasn't been drawn in so many different directions.
I'm laughing. I find it a little funny to think about the person who's listening to this podcast who also has the 6 browser windows open and is trying to answer some email while going through this. Who was just having that oh shoot moment.
We see you.
Yeah. Also, though, we feel you.
Yeah, exactly.
That is the pace of our life. Well, how then can we start to enter into, you've given this idea of just focusing on one thing and maybe that can act as a form of fast, but are there some practical ways that you've kind of entered into fasting where you do give your attention to maybe the solitary moment or other aspects of fasting and focus?
Yeah, well, in the book, there's basically 7 practices for each week that are to help, and they're meditative practices. So like Lectio Divina, every week there's a scripture passage that helps us. And actually for that week, the scripture passage is the woman who's anointing Jesus and, the Pharisees or the other disciples who are complaining about the waste of the oil. And Jesus is like, look at what a beautiful thing she's doing because of her full presence to me in this moment. And I think it's such a beautiful invitation to us to think about, when are those times when I give myself over to something so fully and with such devotion. So there's Lectio Divina, there's Visio Divina, so there's a piece of art in each chapter that invites us into a visual reflection. There's a desert story from the Desert Elders for each chapter. So, and all of those are meant to be like both touchstones and anchors, as well as sparks for us to consider. Then, what are the places in my own life that I could that I get distracted, that I want to return again to that kind of deep core of longing and desire. The idea is that we are hungering so much for something, and we're trying to fill that hunger with all of these things that don't actually satisfy us. And so the retreat is about pausing and listening and giving space. And through the practices, because they're all meant to be contemplative practices, giving us space to then listen to our own hearts to, what is it that would truly nourish us? And then how do we direct our attention and our awareness in that way so that we can feel more nourished to be able to go about our day.
Well, how have you encountered some benefits through practicing fasting?
Well, I feel like that the whole journey of letting go is a lifelong journey. And a lot of it for me is about kind of surrendering my own need to make things happen. So one of the ones I identify probably the most with is kind of fasting from planning and deadlines, because I am really great at planning, and it serves me very well in running an Online Abbey.
Sure.
And I'm not saying that I need to get rid of that, but there's a way in which I tend to live in the future a lot, because I'm always kind of anticipating what's coming. I'm always looking at deadlines. I'm always, sort of 10 steps ahead of myself or 2 years out in the planning calendar. And so there's an invitation for me to, again, bring my awareness back to myself, but also more importantly, to see how I might surrender or yield to that kind of holy longing that's in me that is leading me perhaps in a different direction. So part of the problem might be with planning so much and so far ahead is that then I miss, what the divine desire is in the midst of that.
Mm.
And so for me, fasting is largely about continuing to get out of my own way and continuing to surrender and to yield my need to control things or my need to direct the way things are going to unfold, and then listen to how that's actually unfolding and ripening within me. And I need space to do that, because if I'm always rushing around, like, the planning and the deadlines work really well, and they serve to keep me like kind of on that surface level of things, and I get things done. And there is also that deeper invitation to really listen and, yeah, and yield. I like that word yield a lot, because it's sort of that, in that image of softening. How do we soften? And the kind of image of grasping too, like we spend so much of our time like grasping, wanting things, wanting to make things happen, right? We live in a culture that's like, let's make it happen, right?
Yeah, you got to produce, right? Yeah.
Right. We got to produce, let's set the goals and all of that stuff. And so again, some of those things can be helpful in the right time, but if that's the way we're operating all the time, then we lose touch with that more organic part of ourselves that's maybe unfolding into something unexpected that we haven't made room for. So the fasting, again, is about kind of clearing space for that.
Yeah. A lot of times it pays to have, in a way, something else to fill the space that we're clearing out. Like, I think, okay, so let's say we're at the beginning of Lent and I've decided to give up chocolate. I kind of need something to replace that fixation. You've lifted up some contemplative practices. Specifically, you mentioned Lectio Divina. Are there other contemplative practices that help you kind of fill that space to just be present in the moment?
Yeah. So another practice is breath prayer, which is, I love breath prayer because it's so simple. So you basically have a word or a phrase that you say on the inhale and a word or phrase you say on the exhale. This is an ancient practice that we have, from very, very early church teaching. And what I love about the practice is that, well, in the book, I suggest certain phrases, but you can always make your own. So you can create whatever breath prayer you want. And so it's, if you can just sit for 5 minutes in the morning and let that prayer carry you into that space of openness and receiving. And then you can return to it during the day. You could set a little chime on your phone, maybe 4 times a day, and you pause for a minute and repeat that breath prayer to yourself. So it becomes a little anchor throughout the day to return to, and a little reminder that there's something more waiting for you if you open your heart and pause and let yourself sort of be in that space of openness. There's also this contemplative walks are also suggested, because I also believe very much in engaging the body in our practice. And so I think our body has an awful lot of wisdom to teach us. So much of our modern life is lived in the head. And so contemplative walks are about, engaging in the body and then being out in the world. You don't even have to go very far, but looking for what is shimmering for you or calling for you in some way, in connection to the different themes. So there's suggestions for things to look for, but it's really about, again, listening, getting out of your own way and listening for how the sacred might be speaking through, through a tree or the sunlight on a leaf or, the neighbor's dog or, whatever it might be, but inviting you then to really pause with that moment and be with it and receive it. So it's very much a practice of, instead of trying to take something, it's a practice of receiving a gift in that moment.
Are all those examples encounters of shimmering that you've had while on walks?
Yeah. Okay. Yes. So I find, sunlight and of course dogs. Yes, I have a big heart for dogs. But I find animal, I live in the west of Ireland, and we have lots of rivers and canals. So we have herons and we have crows and we have seagulls and all kinds of other birds. And I find I would like to go for walks early in the morning, just when the sun's coming up. And so there's something about the light that speaks to my heart. There's something about the way the birds appear at different moments that speak to my heart. And if I can pause and just receive that, even for a few seconds, just to let my attention sort of honor that gift that's come, that is pure gift. Yeah.
Do you practice fasting as a community with the Abbey of the Arts?
Yeah, well, we're moving through the book together for the season of Lent, and we have an online journey that we're doing, and I recorded the meditations all in audio format. So for people who don't want to just read the book and read the practice, they can listen to me guiding them. For some people, that's helpful, and then there's a forum where people can talk about that and share what they've discovered. So that's a rich way for people to connect over that.
Well, we have just stepped into Lent as we're recording this, so you may not have an answer for this, but have you gotten a sense for how some people are beginning to practice their fasts through this Lenten season?
Well, yeah, we are early on in Lent right now. I guess, well, when we had our opening session, when we prayed the Lectio Divina today with Jesus in the wilderness and hungering, and the word that a lot of people sort of rested on was famished, and which I found kind of interesting. And I think it spoke to my heart, at least, of a real awareness of the way that we are famished for something much richer and meatier and more nourishing than what we're getting. So I think it's kind of that overall sense of like opening our hearts to spirit and saying, show me what's nourishing. Show me. One of the desert stories that we explore in the book is do not feed your heart that which does not nourish your heart. And you could say that in the positive, which is, feed your heart that which nourishes it. And it's such a simple statement, but I think it's goes to the heart of what the fasting is about, which is pay attention to what you're consuming, whether that's food or whether that's media or whether that's, all kinds of distractions. Pay attention to that and see, is that really nourishing to me? And what might I fill that with instead? Like, how might I focus my attention? And part of that is opening the heart and stepping into that space of stillness and silence and listening and engaging with the scriptures and engaging with the desert elders and letting them bring their wisdom to then let that new insight emerge. So we don't come in knowing necessarily what we're longing for, right? We just know that we're hungry.
And so you may not then come in necessarily anticipating what you're going to be fasting from either. Is that true?
Right. Exactly. There's suggestions, for different ways to look at the fasting, but the one that maybe really grabs your heart, you probably won't know until you're in the thick of it. And you suddenly realize, oh, this is really filling my life with things that aren't really enriching for me. How might I look at this differently?
So would you say then that you've given in the book kind of like a 7-week taste and see entry into fasting?
Yeah, that's certainly a good way to express it. Yeah, each week has a different invitation. There's the fasting from multitasking, which I already suggested, already explored. There's fasting from scarcity, that sort of sense of fear and anxiety we have over scarcity. Fasting from speed and rushing, which of course is another one in our daily lives that we're always trying to get things done and get to the end of things. And fasting from holding it all together. So for those of us who maybe are carrying grief that we're trying to stay strong. And I know we live in a culture, again, that encourages us to kind of move on and not really, let ourselves fall apart when we have a big loss, whether that's an illness or a loss of a loved one or even loss of a job or a dream. So how might we let go of that need to be the strong one and hold everything together and create a little space for that vulnerability? And, look to the example, in the scriptures where Jesus weeps, when Lazarus dies, even though he brings him back to life, like he still makes space for that beautiful expression of grief. And so, Yeah. And then fasting from certainty is the other one, which I think is a really hard one for a lot of people because we want to be in control. We want to be sure about things. And yet I think the whole sort of journey of spiritual maturity isn't moving into deeper mystery and realizing, that life is about the paradox of holding grief and joy together and not having to reconcile them necessarily, but holding them together and knowing that the divine, sits with us in that paradox as this mystery. And God is always bigger than the definitions that we have, the boxes that we create.
Do you find in working with the Abbey of the Arts that that people have a hard time grasping the idea of mystery?
I think a lot of people are hungering for that because I think what people come to Abbey of the Arts for in part is because their images of God have been maybe shattered or broken open, or they've they realize they've come to the limits of what their sort of image of God sort of can hold, and that God is always so much bigger than that. And so there's and I also find that people who are drawn both to the contemplative path, so people who are drawn into silence and solitude have naturally, I think, some of that capacity for mystery, because silence, to me, when we move into the silence, we're really resting into mystery because we're moving into that place beyond words. So we're not trying to necessarily put language to it. Yeah. And then of course, the artist, who I think does express through images and words and movement, but art has a way of holding again that tension of the sorrow and the joy together, or different, holds the paradox of life together in a way that's not our kind of rational discourse. And so I think people who identify with those contemplative and creative paths are drawn to mystery. And of course it's challenging because we all want to know what happens. We all want to know how it turns out. We don't, especially if we're in the midst of like our life coming undone, and maybe we've been fired from our job, or we've lost a relationship, and we just don't know what the next steps are. So it's not an easy place to be. And one of the days of the liturgical year I love most actually is Holy Saturday, because to me it's sort of the ultimate. I feel like Holy Saturday is where we live a lot of our lives, in between that death and resurrection space. And we don't know the resurrection's coming in that Holy Saturday space. And so, holding that openness to mystery, and how, when we let go of our certainty, how God might enter in ways that are bigger than what our minds, can plan for or can try and figure out.
Well, as you've mentioned, Lent is useful, purposeful in drawing our attention to fasting and focusing on that which really puts us in connection with the divine. And then, of course, Easter comes, and that is our time for feasting and celebration. Do you find it useful, practical? Do you recommend revisiting fasting then through the rest of the year?
Yeah, I definitely do. I feel like Lent sort of intensifies our focus, and then we can explore these practices and then choose which ones feel most life-giving, and then we, weave them into our lives. I often talk about when Easter comes that, we've spent 40 days in the desert in this intense spiritual practice. And then we get to Easter and we have Easter Sunday. And then we sort of, if we're in a liturgical community, we still are celebrating Easter, but I don't know that we have so much of a set of practices, and that's 50 days, right, until Pentecost. So I talk a lot about what does it mean to practice resurrection? What does it mean to take what's come from our Lenten journey and then let it kind of burst forth into new ways into our daily lives, into our Easter journey, and then into our ordinary time journey. So all of the practices that we do in Lent, I think, are rich and things that that I know I need to keep working on all the time. But some of them will come more to the fore depending on where I am in my life journey. So
I'm curious. Tell us about a practice of resurrection.
Well, I think part of it for me, I'm really struck by the fact that the resurrection narratives are very embodied. So Jesus comes back and his body still has the wounds, right? I find that to be just remarkable and amazing. And I don't know why we don't talk about that more, to live in the wounded body and to, what does it mean to that body then becomes glorified. And so we have, Thomas touching those wounds and sort of that sense of embodiment. And you have the story of Jesus pulling up the nets with the fish that are overflowing. And you have, even just the story of on the road to Emmaus and sitting down to the meal, and they encounter, they see Jesus in that encounter. And so for me, practicing resurrection has a lot to do with honoring the body as the site of our holiest of encounters, even with the wounds and the pain, and even with the pleasure and the joy that it brings. And I think that's where the fasting and the feasting and holding that paradox together kind of comes in. So, yeah.
Oh, thank you. Okay, listener, what might you feel called to fast from? You can share some thoughts in the Rethink Church community, which is a Facebook group. Search for it by that name. If this was a helpful episode for you, then you might want to jump into another episode on spiritual practices. A good listen for that would be Disrupt Your Busy Life and Cultivate a Heart of Loving Kindness with this meditation. That's episode 112, episode 112. If you're artistically inclined, then episode 113 would also be a lot of fun. It's called Art in Your Spiritual Journey. And again, while you're listening, leave a rating and or review. The Compass Podcast is brought to you by United Methodist Communications. We'll be back in a new episode in 2 weeks, so I'll chat at you then. Peace.